A very good morning to everyone, and good afternoon to those of us who are joining from the UK. My name is Daniel Herring, and I am the program leader for our Global Index of Economic Openness. We're really excited to be sharing this report with you today and to look at some of the opportunities, challenges, and risks facing Colombia. At the Legatum Institute, we are committed to creating the pathways from poverty to prosperity. And for us, economic openness and economic well-being are fundamental aspects of prosperity. So thanks to the generosity of the Templeton World Charity Foundation, we've created an index of economic openness to assess how the economic environment is enabling or hindering countries to prosper. And we've managed to look at over 150 countries in that index. As part of this program, we've undertaken a series of case studies. And today, we are launching the Colombian case study, which really goes beyond the data to look at a much deeper way at economic openness in Colombia. Just going to give an overview of the afternoon with us today. So first of all, we're hearing from Flavia Santoro. She's the president of ProColombia, and she's going to be giving some of our welcoming remarks. Following that, we have Stephen Brien, our Director of Policy at the Legatum Institute. Then we're really excited to have a really amazing panel of distinguished guests to give some of their reflections on the report. Unfortunately, you may have seen in the invite, one of our guests is unable to make it. She is Councillor Clara Parra. She's been called into a meeting with President Duque, so she has a good reason for not being here. And at the end, of course, we'll be opening up for questions and answers. Now, you can submit questions as we go through in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And if you have any general comments you'd wish to make, please do so via the chat function, where you can engage, exchange thoughts and ideas on the report. But for now, we'll begin today's session with some opening remarks from the President of ProColombia, Flavia Santoro.
I would like to begin by thanking the Director of Policy of the Legatum Institute, Mr. Stephen Brien, for hosting this event. We greatly appreciate the interest that you have shown in Colombia. The report you have produced on Colombia's economic openness demonstrates that our country is attracting the attention of international markets. This deep dive into our economy highlights important achievements that have put Colombia on the map of the global investor community, and I am very glad we will have the opportunity to discuss them in detail today. I would also like to acknowledge the presence of our ambassador to the UK, Mr. Antonio Jose Ardila, who has supported this effort. Equally, I would like to thank, I know that she's not here, but Ms. Clara Parra, that she's a great advisor and a great advocate for us, and Mr. Rosario Córdoba, President of the Private Council of the Competitiveness. Mr. Andrés Barreto Gonzalez, Superintendent of Industry and Commerce. And of course, I would also like to say hi to Mr. Luis Fernando Mejía, Executive Director at Fedesarrollo. Mr. Germán Espejo, Strategic Communications and Public Affairs Consultant. Mr. Jose Puyana, Executive Director of ProColombia's office in the United Kingdom, and everyone connected to the event. Good morning in Colombia and good afternoon in the UK. I hope that you are all doing well and keeping safe. Our President, Iván Duque, has invited us to join him in the construction of a country that fosters growth with equality, and ProColombia, as part of the government and the Ministry of Trade, Industry and Tourism, contributes to that goal by promoting our country as a leading destination for foreign direct investment, international tourism, and as a world-class provider of non-mineral exports. Despite the challenges that Colombia has faced in the last decades, we strongly believe that our country is and will continue to be a success story. We enjoy solid fundamentals, some of which have been highlighted by the report launched today, that make this purpose a reality. Political stability, one of the oldest democracies and more stable democracies in the region. Consistent improvements in security conditions throughout the country. Economic stability too, fiscal discipline, a strategic geographical location, strong innovation environment, a dynamic and ever-growing market, and of course the best, talented people. Colombia has indeed made significant progress in the last few years to open its economy and to provide a better quality of life for its citizens. We have certainly given the world good reasons to believe in our country. Let me share with you some prevalent facts to support my statement, which have been dealt with and thoroughly analyzed by the Legatum Institute in this report. A few weeks ago, Colombia officially became the 37th member of the OECD, joining Mexico and Chile from Latin America in this select group of countries. These groups are countries concerned for following international policy standards in a wide variety of areas. Besides this, our country is the third largest recipient of foreign investment in Latin America and is among the 30th countries which receive the greatest amount of investment worldwide. The desire and opportunity to invest in Colombia has never been greater. This statement is supported by the 25% year-on-year increase of incoming international capital that we saw in 2019. And in the first quarter of 2020, non-mining foreign direct investment reached more than $2.4 billion, representing a 23% increase as compared to 2019. In addition to that, the report states that investor protections is one of Colombia's best performing elements, ranking 30th globally. This sends a very strong message to those businesses currently looking into our country. The report also highlights as well the ease of doing business in Colombia and acknowledges that our country is moving forward with initiatives such as Estado Simple, Colombia Ágil. Equally, I was very glad to see that the Legatum Institute has looked into Colombia's ambitious infrastructure program, as well as the important progress achieved in the last few years. In fact, Colombia's 4G infrastructure program has been one of the most ambitious in Latin America. This has been reflected in this government's National Development Plan, as well as in our infrastructure master plan. This has led the country to develop a robust pipeline of investment opportunities with projects in roads, in airports, railway, BRT systems, riverway projects, ports and logistic platforms, among others. In terms of trade, as pointed out by this research, Colombia is one of the best connected countries in the region, which makes it a strategic platform for international trade in a context of supply chain disruption. With a strong investor protection, great talent, and a network of 16 free trade agreements granted access to over 1.45 billion consumers, our country is very well positioned for businesses looking to reach any market in the Americas. Even at this juncture, according to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, Colombia's economic forecast for 2020 continue to be the best at the regional level, with a decrease in GDP about 2.4% compared to 5.2% for the whole of Latin America. For 2021, we expect a rebound in the economy. According to estimates by the IMF and the World Bank, next year Colombia could grow at between 3.4 and 3.5%. Let's hope that continues to be the path. Finally, allow me to underline two important aspects of our economy. Colombia hosts one of the World Economic Forum centers for the fourth industrial revolution. It is only the fifth of its kind in the world. It is also the first one in Latin America. This center, nested in Medellin's Innovation District, is harnessing research and local skills to drive innovation, technology, and global change. Regarding tourism, prestigious organisms such as the International Congress and Convention Association, ICA, the United States Tour Operators, and the World Travel Awards have highlighted Colombia's huge potential as a tourism destination which is why it will play a central role in our economic recovery. Those is great news, as in 2019, tourism generated $6.7 billion for our economy and more than 1.9 million jobs in Colombia. These are challenging times, and we know it. Colombia is taking all the measures required to guarantee both the safety of its citizens and the economic recovery of the country. These and our solid foundations allow us to remain optimistic about the future. At ProColombia, we are certain that foreign direct investment, international tourism, and non-mineral exports will play a key role in the economic recovery of Colombia. Some of the suggestions made by the Legatum Institute in this report are relevant and in line with these government priorities. We are ready to contribute to the economic growth of our country and to continue building a greater Colombia on the principles of rule of law, entrepreneurship, and social equality. Colombia is moving forward with confidence in this path. And I really would like to finish. Thank you very much for all of you.
Thank you so much, Flavia, for those reflections. We really, really appreciate them. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Stephen Brien, who's our Director of Policy here at the Legatum Institute. He will be taking us through some of the main findings of the report.
Thank you, Daniel, and Flavia for your comments. I think it's good to be reminded of those three priorities of the presidency in terms of the rule of law, the drive for entrepreneurship, and ensuring the fairness and inclusion of everybody in the process. And this very much accords with our starting point for looking at Colombia and the areas that we think are important. Again, I'm sorry we're not here in person, but as you mentioned, Flavia, these trying times with COVID has prevented us being a good addition to your tourism statistics. But I do hope that later in the year you'll be able to count us as some of your inbound travelers. But to the report itself and economic openness, I'd like to start by explaining what we mean by economic openness and why we've looked at it in the way we have. We look at economic openness across four areas. These are structural aspects of the economy. So we're not necessarily looking at growth rates year on year or what's happened to do with any individual sectors. We're very much focusing on the underlying characteristics of the economy, the sort of core policy-focused areas that government leaders and others can directly make an influence in order to therefore create and enable a platform for trade and commerce to grow. So first of all, we look at what we call market access and infrastructure. And this is to ensure that products and services can be easily produced and delivered to customers, whether domestically or internationally. And obviously, the situation we're in at the moment shows how important that ability to move goods around is, and indeed for people to move around and to connect. And without good quality transport, easy access to electricity and water, communications, etc., a foundation for commerce is always going to be weak. The next bit, enterprise conditions, looks at what it takes to start a business. What's the regulatory environment like? What are the labor market laws like? What's competition policy like? How easy is it for somebody to set up a business and grow it? And obviously this has been a focus, one of the three pillars of the Duque administration, so very much an area that we want to dig into a bit. Investment environment. How easy is it to get capital? What sort of investor protections are there so that investors can feel when they do invest in an enterprise, there's strong corporate governance, there are insolvency laws, there's protection from their capital. And then ultimately, the bedrock of so much of this is the governance of a country. Is there a strong rule of law, the first pillar of the presidency? Is there corruption in the government, or is it run with integrity? Are government services run efficiently? Is there political accountability? These really foundational aspects of society are critical to enable an economic infrastructure to develop. So that's why we also look at governance. So we have gathered data from around the world and compared Colombia against its peers. And this is what we see at the very top level. Colombia is ranked 72nd in the world. So that's basically middle of the table. What's quite interesting about Colombia, when we look across those four pillars I've just described, is actually how balanced it is. 66th in market access infrastructure, 79th in enterprise conditions, 71st in investment environment, and 68th in governance. It's a very balanced performance, and that probably helps. Whereas if you look up and down the table at other countries, you sort of see, say, in Indonesia, with a much weaker market access infrastructure, maybe better enterprise conditions. On the other hand, you sort of see Morocco just below with a very different profile again. And we think that one of Colombia's strengths is the fact that it is actually progressing in a very well-balanced way, and that will really help it going forward. Now, when we look at what's happened in the last 10 years, though, I'm going to paint perhaps a more honest and candid picture of what we really think is happening, that there has been some progress, but so much of the benefit has actually come in that first pillar, market access infrastructure, where improvements, as we've just been hearing about communications, about transport, have really made a great difference. And Colombia has risen the rankings there, so gone ahead of its peers. In the other three big areas, enterprise conditions, investment environment, and governance, what we're seeing is Colombia slipping very slightly, making a little bit of progress, but slipping slightly in the rankings. So Colombia's sort of peer group of countries that are approximately the same level have over the last 10 years improved at a faster rate. And that should be encouragement to continue the progress. The government's agenda is one that in the report we are very favorable towards. But I think what we'll see as we look forward in this presentation is the need to accelerate and put more momentum behind it, particularly in these areas. But to understand how the report works, let me take governance and unpack that to the next layer, because governance itself could be regarded as a bit of an abstract concept. We then break it down, as we do with every pillar, into different elements, which are then much more defined and policy focused. So for governance, we look at executive constraints. To what extent is the executive, appropriately constrained by the legislature? Is there a separation of powers? And that's a fundamental political setup. Likewise, political accountability. Are there democratic processes? Are the powerful held to account? And obviously, 59th, the situation in Colombia, of a long-term democracy is very much shining through in that ranking. On the other hand, rule of law, a rather weak area, and appropriately so to be the great first pillar of the priorities, because it does come in quite a bit weaker. Now we see a huge amount of the issue that we're seeing there is also around procedural issues, administrative issues, as much as the core sense of justice. We'll come on to that in a minute. Government integrity, doing okay, but I think we see issues around corruption, which we'll come on to. Government effectiveness, the government itself is running well. Regulatory quality focuses on some of the procedural aspects of dissemination of legislation, a big issue for the OECD. And now that Colombia's joined the OECD, I expect that will be seeing progress. But I'd also say one thing that we have seen in looking at other countries who have made big jumps forward to join organizations, such as Romania joining the European Union, made great strides to, as it were, get over the hurdle and get accession to the European community, European Union. But at that stage, it took its foot off the gas and has not continued the progress. So I'd say the big emphasis we'd want to place on continued momentum, and don't regard the joining of the OECD as something to sort of pat yourself on the back and sit down and be very pleased. It's actually just the first rung in the ladder, and keep going. So that's how we unpack it. Each of these pillars has several elements behind it, and that's how we do all our measurements. So now let's think about what we're seeing and what we think is necessary going forward. Flavia mentioned non-mineral exports once or twice, and I think that's a really important thing to think about, because Colombia, being a resource-rich economy, derives great advantage from that. But what we see is that economic openness and how we want to measure it and what we're trying to achieve from it is actually much better captured by looking at the non-resource economy. What are all the other things that are happening in the economy? How well are people engaging with each other? And then for a comparative measure across the world, we want to think about who's available to create markets, who's available to produce products and services, and that's the working age population. So we've always focused on this idea of productive capacity, which is the non-resource economy that's produced from the working age population. And we see that that's really what economic openness drives. And that for us is the benchmark against which we judge countries. And as we see, over the last 10 years, Colombia has had a pretty good solid growth rate, 2.3%. That's a per capita growth rate of the underlying productiveness of the economy. And we've done longer term research on this. And we would say that Colombia is in that good zone of actually having very long term improvements. Now, I think the question is, as we go forward, where should Colombia aim to be, and what's it going to take to get there? So what we see going forward is, and if picking up what the OECD have referenced as a benchmark, if we take a Spain, what would it take for Colombia to progress and develop its economy to be like Spain is today? And what we see is that when we look at countries around the world, countries with more open economies that have these four pillars in stronger shape have higher productive capacity. At the other end, perhaps the Democratic Republic of Congo's or the Yemen's of this world, where obviously there's a lot more problems going on, their productive capacity is lower. But even more importantly, when you look across a time period, say 10 years, as a country improves its economic openness, so too does its productive capacity go up, or if it deteriorates in economic openness, its productive capacity goes down. So these are levers that do make a difference over a decade or multi-decade time frame. So we believe these are actually quite powerful levers to help drive an economy forward. So then if we roll Colombia's economy forward, I think what could we achieve? And if we wanted to pick a number for the sake of just sort of constructing an ambition, in 25 years for Colombia to reach Spain's level of economic productivity, that would be equivalent of about 6% per annum growth rate per capita. That's a pretty impressive. It's a bit like what India is doing today. That's what it would take to get there. And it would require, to match up to the economic openness we're looking at, a pretty consistent improvement of about another 18 points. If you think Colombia has achieved about a 5-point increase over the last decade, you'd need to increase that rate to get to Spain in 25 years. A tall order, but we think it's worth putting a marker in the sand as an ambition. And then we say, okay, well, the index allows us to think through where are the gaps. So if we look at where Spain is versus Colombia, and where are the differences in market access and infrastructure, in investment environment, and enterprise conditions, we can map out the scale of the target. And what's quite interesting, if we look at that, two big areas that are bigger than the others, just slightly, is that governance and enterprise conditions are the two biggest bars. And that tells you that these are the most important areas of focus, and that very much aligns with the government's agenda. So I think we're absolutely saying, the government has got the right focus. I think what we're also saying is we want to help give it a bit of a push, keep the momentum going. So let's unpack that and look at the big areas that we think need to be addressed. So from the report, four challenges and opportunities. I think continue to improve infrastructure and trade across borders. A lot of progress has been made, but I think when you look at Colombia's challenging starting point vis-a-vis the terrain and the geography, much like from our conversation in Indonesia, slightly different challenge, but again, an archipelago has transport challenges. Likewise, a very mountainous country has communication and transport challenges. We'd say that still work to do there. The next area around enterprise conditions and entrepreneurship is about reducing the burden of regulation, simplifying labor market rules. We'll talk a bit more about that. Third area, reforming the court systems, essentially tackling the issues around rule of law. And then finally, improving governance, and in particular, tackling corruption. So what I'll do is I'll walk through very high level these themes. All the detail is in the report. So let me just start with infrastructure and trade. A number of areas we want to focus on here. First up is communication, critical, and even more so, I think, as there are a few hundred of us on Zoom today, this afternoon, this morning, the quality of communications, the quality of internet is going to be so important going forward in the post-COVID economy. Now, with 36 million unique subscribers, internet access is very widespread within Colombia. But versus international benchmarks, it is slow. And one of the things that we've noted in comparison to other countries, a lot of internet hosting is outside of the country, and that is a big dampener on bandwidth speed. So we would certainly say that's an area to work on. It will become increasingly important as we all want to have Zoom conversations with each other. I think on electricity, we would be saying fantastic coverage. 98% of the rural population has access to electricity. But because of transmission issues, the reliability is an issue in many areas. Obviously, in Medellin, Bogota, levels of outages are very low. But as we head out towards Barranquilla, we see a very different situation. And it's the intermittence, it's the unreliability that creates a big issue, because they need to have reserve generators to not be able to be confident about what you can do. So I think reliability of electricity, given that the broad generation and coverage is there, is the priority. And dealing with distribution and transmission issues is the big thing there. And then roads, I think, Flavia's already outlined, and we've certainly recognized huge work here. I think what we've found in our discussions with experts in this space is the need to shift not just thinking about the primary and secondary roads, but also tertiary roads, to make sure that the agenda of fairness and inclusion allows people all over the country to connect economically, to connect socially. And the other little thing that I think that we feel is also necessary to point out is, when trading internationally, fantastic level of trade agreements. But at the moment, the level of inspections and the time it takes to get through the ports is probably an issue that could really make a big difference. So that at the margins, rather than going out and trying to spend time and energy signing another trade deal, get the processes as smooth as possible to make sure you're making the most of what has already been agreed, which is an admirable level of trade openness. And I think many of your OECD colleague countries could do with sort of taking a leaf out of Colombia's book in terms of the extent of trade deals. So our recommendations here would be, as I said, local hosting of internet content, improving the transmission distribution of electricity, really thinking about a growth-focused agenda on transport, and supercharging the PPPs. They've been doing really well, but I think from our conversations, let's work out how to get more investment funneled through those to really get the investment in infrastructure going, because that is a multi-generation issue. And the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the best time to build a road was 20 years ago. So we'd certainly be advocating good energy in that. Now, if I move to the enterprise conditions pillar, the big issue here, burden of regulation. Now, that's something that I think is not a new story to all of you, and certainly our sense is that actually in the last year or two, there's already been a lot of work, a lot of focus here in terms of tax simplification, the one-stop shops that have come in. So there is an improving environment here. But I think when you look at where Colombia is starting in this space and where the South Koreas or the Indonesia of this world are, I would be saying, let's keep working at it. Let's keep hacking away at those unnecessary regulations. Let's keep trying to make life as smooth as possible for those who are seeking to do business. And also, I think on the labor market side, this is obviously, quite political, I think quite connected to the fairness agenda. It's a difficult area. But the more we can work in an environment whereby people want to buy into the system, whereby those high rates of informality can get addressed, and actually it makes sense for people to employ people formally, for people to have more flexible labor contracts and have the social protection at the same time. That's an area we think needs more work. I have been fascinating to understand and to get a bit more about how there have been specific efforts made to create new means of bringing the informal labor market into the system. And I think it's quite innovative. I think there's a lot more to be done rather than regarding that as sort of a side effort to deal with a problem. How do you address the underlying issues and make sure that, generally speaking, everybody sees being part of the formal system as a benefit? Because there are obviously the cost that people recognize at the moment, but let's make sure that everybody sees the benefits in terms of pensions, social security, etc., that actually being part of the formal system is a help for everybody, because it allows people to tap into the formality of the economy and the support systems that also exist. That's something we've certainly noticed in the UK in the COVID environment, that those people who were, as it were, part of the formal economy and had tax records and were linked in were more easily able to be helped than those who were not, and therefore it took more time. So there is a real benefit in times of hardship to be part of that formality. So our recommendations there: reduce the burdens, reduce non-wage costs for employers. I think this is an issue that has been, I've been seeing as I've researched Colombia, back from the 90s, this has been an agenda item that sort of gets addressed, they creep back up, gets addressed again. So I'd say that's something nearly probably a continuous work on that. I think, we are seeing it getting easier to pay taxes online. We are seeing simplification. And I'd say keep continuing on that. So the next area, investment environment. I think what we're looking at in the investment environment, the main theme is around court reform. I would say, when we look at the other issues that investors are interested in, there's been good progress on property rights, strong corporate governance, as Flavia has already mentioned. But the other issue that investors find very important around the world is to have that sense that there's a good system of contract enforcement, so that if the other protections don't work, can you go to court and seek remedies? And this is where the international benchmarking for Colombia is at its weakest. About 107th in the world for contract enforcement. And digging into this and looking at it, the predominant issue seems to be an issue around delays and costs and sort of procedural issues, as opposed to a sense of a lack of justice or the wrong rules. So our sense is that's the issue that needs to get addressed. So when we think about the opportunities to change, we will be looking at better administration. Countries that have really improved here have taken a lot more burden of administration off the judges themselves, have used a lot more electronic case management just to get the system flowing faster. Also, looking at more specialized courts, so creating specialist commercial courts, having more specialist training for commercial cases. The tempo and the issues of commercial justice and law is quite different from a lot of other areas. And therefore, it's like trying to get fast trains and slow trains running on the same track. It's very difficult to get both of them working optimally. And therefore, a lot of countries are splitting that up. I think there's opportunities for better training, better legal training in the first place. In the early part of the legal system, I think there are some quite critical evaluations of the early stage legal training in Colombia. And I think ultimately there are also opportunities to improve the oversight, and that will help with trust and a sense that things are working. But I think our first sense will be that the quick wins come around the procedural areas, because it tends not to have to do with too many vested interests. It doesn't change the ways of working of the core judges too much. It does allow that to get smoother. And as the old saying goes, justice delayed is justice denied. So prompt resolution can really help improve the quality of the investment environment. And then the last area we want to talk about is tackling corruption. Now, this is an area that I think, as Colombians, I'm sure you don't need any introduction. And I'm really going to give you a little bit more of, I think, of an international perspective on this. And when we look internationally at Colombia, what do we see? We see that confidence in the government and the courts has declined, and that it's declined 10 places over the last 10 years, government integrity internationally, and that the sort of the confidence in the underlying rule of law, as we said, at 137th, has also declined. So, why is this? Definitely, when we're looking at this in terms of the expert panels, they very definitely saying from an international perspective, they have been less confident in the Colombian system, and that's brought out by estimates that say it's over 5% of GDP is the cost of business of corruption. and that so a lot of people have had to pay bribes. And what we're seeing here is, in effect, it's a bit like the informality issue in the labour market. The system is not set up in a way that allows for people to sort of voluntarily, as it were, buy into applying the laws. For too many people and for too big a section of society, there are ways where it's easier to work around the system than to work with it. It's easier to engage in crony capitalism than real capitalism. It's easier to bribe than to go through the queuing process. And the system allows that too much. And I would say, I think we need to look at this at two levels. There's sort of addressing it here and now level, which is quite operational. And then I think there's also a deeper level. So, addressing it here and now is to, first of all, recognize and acknowledge that this is not a new problem. It is one that this government and past governments have been working on. And we still need more progress there. So, the opportunity that we see is perhaps a more centralized body to manage the approach, perhaps more special prosecutors, more transparency, and also at a sort of deeper level, making these oversight bodies, such as the National Electoral Council, have more power outside the electoral calendar and to be seen to be a little bit more distant from the seat of power. Other things other countries have done, Estonia is often heralded as a great example of this, is, if you put more things online, if you have a system whereby there aren't those gaps in the processes that allow people to seek a rent and make a rent out of it, you can dramatically reduce corruption. When we were in Ghana, we heard a great story of how the vehicle licensing authority nearly overnight went online, and they actually kept the staff on because they didn't want to have all the redundancies. But the process went online, and there was a dramatic reduction in the corruption around vehicle licenses. So real evidence that smooth online processes are actually a key tool to helping root out certainly the smaller scale corruption. And then the transparency of big procurement issues is another way of rooting out more of the large scale corruption. But I think at its heart, and this speaks a little bit to the third pillar, the third priority of the Duque administration is this issue around cultural transformation. How do we create an environment in which people want to buy into the system? People see the benefits of actually working within the grain of the system rather than working around it. And that is reference to the labor laws, to labor informality, to the way people apply for licenses, to the way in which people work through the courts, to the way in which procurement operates. It's a much deeper, longer term issue. And one of the things that we've seen around the world is there's a bit of a debate often about whether does economic development help root out corruption, or does getting rid of corruption help economic development? At one level, it's a bit of both. But as we've done our analysis, what we see at the heart of both of these is actually the social contract and the quality of both formal and informal institutions. If the informal and formal institutions of society are right, you get both an economic uplift and you also get a reduction in corruption. And that's why these two things seem to come together. But our sense is that if you focus on getting both formal and informal institutions right, you get the springboard effect, a launch pad to greater progress. So I'd like to leave it at that with some thoughts about if getting to Spain in 25 years is our target, will an evolutionary approach suffice? Or do we need to be thinking about a more all-embracing transformation? And as part of that, what's needed to reset the social contract? And these are one level are questions I'd love to leave to my fellow panelists to help answer. And I'm sure through the Q&A, we might have an opportunity to come back to them. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen, for sharing that with us. We now have the opportunity to hear from some of our panelists. If I could turn first to Luis Fernando Mejía. He's the Executive Director of Fedesarrollo, and he will be sharing with us his thoughts. So Luis, I'll share with you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you all for the invitation. Stephen, congratulations on the report for you and all the Legatum team. It was a very interesting report. it pinpoints at many of the structural issues that you just mentioned that have prevented faster growth on the Colombian economy, and it was a very interesting read. And I think it's especially valuable when you have this comparative perspective, when you can actually see how other countries are doing, and that gives you where are the main gaps, and I think that's very useful for public policy. I would like to comment on three issues: trade openness, infrastructure, and a little bit about governance. And also, I would like to make a comment that is not directly reported in this research that I think would add the value of the conclusions for public policy. So first, on trade openness, one of the main phenomena that economic literature has identified is the strong relationship between trade openness and economic growth. There's of course a debate about reverse causality, whether it's actually development, the thing that implies more trade openness, but the serious structural literature has actually identified a strong causality between trade openness and economic growth. So I think it's very important that you mentioned this in the report. Colombia, unfortunately, despite all the free trade agreements that has signed for the past 20 years, still is a very closed economy. The sum of exports plus imports over GDP is about 35%. We are one of the most closed economies in the region, just behind Brazil and Argentina. We're way below Mexico, Chile, Peru. So there are a lot of issues there in terms of increasing trade openness. And we're doing a small study about the impact that trade openness could have in productivity growth. We estimate that if Colombia could actually increase its trade openness from 35% to 55%, then productivity growth could be 20% higher. So that's a huge increase that could lead to more faster growth, and that would be very important. Now, in terms of infrastructure, you mentioned, Stephen, the very important progress made by the country for the past 10 or 12 years in terms of infrastructure investment and the quality of our infrastructure. I think that the current crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, opens up a very important opportunity for thinking about infrastructure as a counter-cyclical policy measure that could increase growth in the short term, but also have these important effects on the medium and long term in terms of having higher competitiveness, higher productivity. So it fulfills these two objectives about increasing growth in the short term, but also increasing growth in the medium and long term. And I think the government could set up a large infrastructure investment project. And you mentioned tertiary roads. Well, there are about $2.6 billion in royalties to be approved. So, you know, the government could set up an important program for infrastructure in secondary and tertiary roads that could be very important in this current juncture. The third point is about governance. You mentioned that some of the lower rankings that we have in these four structural analyses that you're doing are actually in this pillar of governance. And you mentioned the importance of a judicial reform. The question is how to implement a reform. Colombia has failed many times to reform the justice system. So I think we have to attack this in a different way. Maybe instead of aiming for a huge, very ambitious judicial reform, maybe focusing on some of the aspects that you mentioned, Stephen, about bringing, for example, technology to process selection and so on and so forth. That would be good, because if we wait for a huge structural reform, then probably we're not going to be able to do it, although this current juncture maybe opens up the possibility for that. Another point is the importance of the implementation of regulatory impact assessment. You mentioned the quality of regulation as being one of the drawbacks in terms of our rankings. Colombia has made some strides in advancing for a better regulation. Unfortunately, COVID-19, I think, has opened up the opportunity for an increase in regulation from the executive branch of the government. It would be better if we can speed up the process of having a full regulatory impact assessment across all branches of the government, thereby increasing the cost of the quality of regulation. And so those are my 3 points. And finally, I would like to mention something that I missed from the report, and Stephen, and that would be, I think it would be good to look up in the next reports. It's about sustainability of growth. The report is more focused on the traditional macro structural variables. And I think that the current crisis and for the past few years, there's been a discussion about the sustainability of growth. And I think there are 2 dimensions that be worth to look upon for the next reports. One is sustainability in terms of the environmental approach. Is green growth a strategy for the country? How the Colombia is actually contributing to the sustainability and the green growth agenda, which I think it's key for the current years. And also the sustainability from the point of view of equity. The report doesn't mention the wide disparities that the Colombian economy has in terms of income distribution. You mentioned something related to informal markets, which of course has an impact in terms of the distribution of income. But it would be good to think about how Colombia compares in terms of these 2 dimensions: environmental sustainability and equity. Because if you want to think about long-term development, of course, economic growth is important, but also sustainability of growth and equity, I think, are 2 objectives that have to be attained. So that was my comment. Thank you very much. I enjoyed a lot the reading of this report, Stephen.
Thank you so much, Luis, for those comments. We really appreciate them and really insightful. We're just going to now hear from Andrés Barreto Gonzalez. He is the Superintendent for Industry and Commerce, and I'd love to hand over to you now for your reflections.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you so much for the invitation. You'll have to excuse my English is not my native tongue, and I don't use it as much as I wanted to. I enjoyed the report as well, and my reflections on it are maybe, the first one will be the paradox we've always had between business conditions and a competitive market versus regulation. We do think that Colombia, being a part of the OECD for now, has had to come through 2 or 3 committees and has had to perform very well in the exams we have in order to pass those committees. That will give us just the idea that our regulation is enforced and that regulation is sufficient in order to improve competition, consumer protection, and now that we are in the terrain of the digital arena or the digital era, I think we have a fair, good regulation in these things. So I always have these questions about the reports, about not only the one that we're analyzing now, but always the paradox between the business conditions and the regulatory side. I think they go hand in hand. They are not rivals, if you might. I think they serve each other the purpose that having good governance and having a good rule of law, it's actually a condition for economic openness and better markets and, of course, better authorities. And I think that will give a fair tranquility to the investors and a good sense of what is happening in a country. So that will be my first reflection on the report. My second thought is about infrastructure, something Luis Fernando talked about, and of course it's a huge challenge. Colombia, with its geography, has huge challenges about these projects. And I take infrastructure because my part in what the government is, being the competition authority, we have had cases concerning antitrust practices in these sectors. So I think reflecting on my first thought, we should not have this paradox between the applying the law, the rule of law, versus making business. We need transparent business, we need good investment, but we need, of course, to comply with the law and to make the best investments possible without breaching the law. So I think infrastructure it's a huge challenge for now. One, because we have these COVID situations. Second, because many of the infrastructure projects have been stopped. And thirdly, because we don't want to be an obstacle for that, but we do have to oversight and apply the rule of law for these projects. But I do take into account that we have scaled 18 positions in 10 years. So mainly the broad picture is not as bad as we might think. Investment is a huge concern because it decreases 4 positions in 10 years, going to 71. And we are number 13 in protection of investment. So I think there's a paradox here as well, because we decrease in this openness, but we increase in the protection of the investment. That has to do a lot with what I do in the rule of law and as a competition and a consumer authority. So this gives me a lot of food for thought, if you might, of what maybe it's failing in our legal system or in the applying of the law. Thirdly, business conditions. We increased 3 positions in 10 years. We're now in number 79. And this is my favorite part of the report, because actually there's a specific reference to the competition authority, which is the job I perform in Colombia. So for me, it's very good to see that you guys analyze that we have a good competition law, that we have a good competition authority. Thank God we made this reform about the competition law, and we are the sole competition authority, and this gives us a lot of certainty and legal security in Colombia, that you only have to face one regulator, and I think this is very good. And secondly, is that it's an effective regulator. We do have the tools, we do have the means, and we do have the power to apply the law. So I think having a sole competition authority is very good. And I will take a step back regarding the OCDE. And it was one of the first committees we approved. Colombia just recently entered the OCDE in 2020, but we have been approved to this committee from 6 years ago. So this gives us a picture of what happened in the beginning. It's now being, if you might, proven by the report. I think that we do have a strong competition authority and a good legal basis or a good competition law. And the only critique you make in the report, which is fair because it has been pointed out by the OCDE as well, is that there's a huge complaint always about the president nominating the authority. However, we implemented some legal reforms in order for the election of this position, and you have to go through a process. It's mainly an open process, but of course there will always be the discussion between those authorities that are independent. Is the case of Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, to talk about the region, and what happens in Colombia. However, if you take the reports and take the reality of what happened to those authorities that praise the fact that they are independent, they have been hugely punished by their governments in budget and in their own independence, because the way to strangle their independence is through budget. While here, being a part of the executive and having a direct link to the presidency or being appointed and nominated by him gives you a good perspective, not only on the budget, but of course in the capacity you have for negotiating with the Congress and having this executive power in order to influence, in the good sense of the word, in not being strangled by the executive when you're going very independent in your own arena. So I do enjoy very much that part of the report. And governance, we scaled 3 positions in 10 years, being number 68. It's still a huge challenge because we decrease in rule of law. So it's another paradox. We improve in governance by decreasing the rule of law, which is very, very interesting. And I would like to point out something I read in the report, which is not accurate. The attorney is not nominated by the president. The president confirms three names that are sent to the Supreme Court of Justice. The general attorney of this country is elected by an election, voted by the judges of the Supreme Court, not by the president. It is true that he gives the names, but it's fair to say that our constitution says that is the Supreme Court, and this last general attorney who was recently elected this year was elected by 16 votes of the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court in so many ways it's the one who oversees the work of the general attorney. Integrity of the government, it's a huge issue, as Luis Fernando pointed. We decreased 4 positions in 10 years, being number 72. So there's a huge challenge, because one of the key points of this government is the fight against corruption. And of course, people tend to think of corruption from the public sector without having a holistic perspective of the many factors that affect corruption, and me being an anti-corruption authority have to see a lot of these in the day-to-day basis of work, but still a huge challenge here. And number 98 in legislative quality, we decreased 14 positions, and this was before the OCDE. So this is, I think, another great conclusion of the report. Unless we find a better way to produce better laws, or to stop believing that everything has to be ruled through laws, we will have an excess burden in regulatory things, but not law quality, which is, I think, what the report reflects, and I couldn't be more in agreement with this conclusion. I'm not a very fan of laws. However, challenges that are not...
Sorry, Andre, I'm gonna ask you just to wrap up there. We're just running out of time.
Okay, great. So I think challenges, electronic justice, judicial administrations, and to enforce oversight. There are other issues about entertainment industries, what Flavia talked about, not mineral exports. So there's much more work to have in other reports, but I thank you for the opportunity, and I think the conclusions are fair of the reality of where we're living in this country right now.
Thank you. We've got two more panelists. I'm going to ask them to speak quickly so that we can have some time for Q&A. Rosario Córdoba, who's the president of the Private Council of Competitiveness. Again, if you just keep your comments to kind of 2 or 3 minutes, that would be great.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. I would like to say that the Economic Openness Index is very well aligned with the mission and the work we do at the Private Council on Competitiveness. And I'd like to say that I was very pleased to see that our National Competitiveness report was very useful in the case study of Colombia. That was very pleasing. I would like to concentrate in education and social mobility, also tax reform, and some about tertiary roads. And although Colombia has made significant progress in expanding coverage in all education levels, access to quality education across regions and economic status is unequal. And students' performance in international standardized tests in reading, math, and critical thinking is very low. And if we're talking about productivity, we really have to concentrate in education. We really have to make a big effort, and mainly now, after this crisis, COVID crisis, what we have seen is a large gap between those children that are able to have digital appliances and those that have not. So there we have large gaps that we have to work on. We also have to evaluate teachers. In Colombia, that's been a hard process. We haven't been able to evaluate the teachers in order to promote them and in order to have some feedback on the way they're teaching the children in the classroom. And then we should also concentrate in a structural tax reform. We've tried lots of reforms in Colombia in the last years, but however, we still have a very low revenue. It's only around 19% of GDP. In other Latin American countries, it's 21%. In the OECD countries, it's 34%. And we really have to modernize the tax administration agency in order to enforce the collecting of taxes. You mentioned, and I'm trying to be very fast because you need the time, but you also mentioned tertiary roads. We really have to connect the country. If we want to develop this country and we want to reduce regional gaps, we really have to build the roads. We have to make people, that we need to connect markets mainly. That's what we really need to do. And finally, I was going to mention the environmental institutional framework in order to reduce the extraction of natural resources and improve their productivity, preserve Colombia's natural capital and biodiversity, which can be additional sources of growth, reduce greenhouse emissions, and help Colombians better adapt to climate change. In Colombia, the environmental institutions are fragmented, politicized, and lack technical and financial resources to effectively manage the territory. Between 2008 and 2000, natural resource loss and damages related to greenhouse gases and particulate matter emissions were on average 6% of Colombia's GNP. Between 2001 and 2018, the country has lost 0.43 million hectares of natural forest, mainly in the Amazon region, and there is land use conflict in 28% of Colombia's territory, largely between livestock and other uses, and there is a lack of capacity to effectively protect Colombia's national parks. So if we're talking about productivity, we really have to concentrate on our national resources, because there we're losing part of our productivity. I think that with that, I finish. Daniel.
Thank you so much, Rosario. That was really, really interesting. Thank you. Finally, we have Germán Espejo. He's a former government advisor, now in private practice. Germán, what do you see? You were going to speak to us specifically on governance, some of the government's major strengths and what opportunities there are for further improvements to governance. I'll ask you to keep it brief again so that we have some time for Q&A at the end.
Sure. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for the invitation, Stephen. Thank you. Well, very briefly, in terms of strength, I think one of the biggest strengths of Colombia in terms of governance is a long tradition of peaceful and democratic alternation of power. Even in the height of the conflict, we managed to have free and fair elections, particularly at the presidential level. I believe the system of checks and balances works fairly well in Colombia. The executive, I believe, is particularly accountable. And we have strong institutions in each of the three branches of government, branches of power, sorry. Then I would distance myself on one of the statements of the report in terms of the role of the military and the police, without, of course, disregarding the seriousness of the accusations on abuses conducted by the military, which have to be dealt in justice. I think the role of the military and the police have been fundamental to provide the security conditions that allowed better governance, and ultimately much more economic prosperity. And also, I believe it was the effort, the security effort, that eventually led to provide the conditions for the peace agreement that ended half a century-old armed conflict. And I think a testament of that professionalism gathered by the military over the years is the fact that Colombia became a NATO global partner in 2017, being the only partner in Latin America and joining other countries around the globe like Australia or South Korea. And finally, definitely the membership of the OECD is a strength in terms of governance because of the standards and best practices Colombia will be able to adopt and follow over the years. In terms of opportunities, definitely the rule of law is the most challenging area. I firmly believe that the justice system needs a complete overhaul, as many of the panelists have stated. I would envision this is not only a matter of passing a bill, a big reform bill in Congress, although it might, but I envision a kind of Plan Colombia for justice. And I probably can elaborate more about it in the Q&A, but I think it's the kind of effort in terms of resources, equipment, training, and policy objectives that the military got with the Plan Colombia, that we could do something similar to judges and the justice system. In terms of the law enforcement, I think rightly so, but our police, our national police has been too much focus on dealing with the conflict and with dealing with the drug trafficking threat. And because of that, they have been distracted from the more traditional policing responsibilities, community policing, for instance, which I think is increasingly important in today's Colombia in terms of urban security, but also rural. Then I think the panelists and Stephen have spoken extensively on corruption. I would only add that, of course, we need to tighten the grip. Reducing impunity, I think, is essential, because impunity works as an incentive for more cases of corruption. So we need to bring impunity down for the cases of corruption that have been already committed. And then I think the other very important point here is focusing also on local governments. I mean, the central government is doing quite a lot of different initiatives, and there has been over the years substantial progress, but corruption at the local level is also critical, even more important at some points. So focusing on how to bring best practices, standards, oversight over what is being done by mayors at the local level and governors is very important. And finally, in terms of government effectiveness, I think that the biggest challenge and opportunity here is Colombia needs to continue moving forward in terms of increasing institutional presence throughout the territory. That's the cause of many of our problems, and I think is part of many of the solutions we have to reach as a nation. So it's not just control that could be done by the armed forces. It's about a whole of state approach where we really have institutional presence, delivering services to a part of the population that today lives in the periphery without access to many of these services. In that regard, I think implementing the peace agreement is important. A peace agreement that, in my view, is larger than FARC. Is about also rural development, it's about political inclusion, and it's about then ultimately to connect that periphery of Colombia and bring it into the 21st century. In that regard, I think the PEDET initiative, the territorial development plan the presidency is conducting is a step in the right direction. And finally, also in terms of delivering services, as we have a decentralized executive, it's very important to bring in local governments in updating their capabilities, their standards, and their ability to deliver services. So with that, I would end my comments for now.
Thank you so much, Germán. We have time for 2 or 3 questions for Q&A before finishing. So I'm going to ask this first question to Louise, and it is, so far during the pandemic, unemployment is around 20% and informality is around 50%. What are some measures that the country can take to reduce the negative impact of the pandemic?
Well, you're right. I mean, the numbers for April were very bad. Unemployment shot up from 12.5 to almost 20% of the total labor force. One of the largest increase in terms of the unemployment rate in the region and even in the world. So definitely we do have to move forward in terms of reducing the unemployment rate. Colombia has had for the past few years a high structural unemployment rate. So there are some issues that Stephen mentioned in his presentation about thinking about, for example, reducing non-wage labor costs. That measure was very effective in increasing formality in 2012 in about 4 percentage points. So deepening this type of measures would be important. Thinking about, for example, having differentiated minimum wages across regions. Labor productivity is actually very different in Bogotá than, for example, in La Guajira. So thinking about having a national minimum wage, of course, that impacts a lot informality rates, which can go as high as 70% in some regions, whereas in Bogotá and Medellin are below 45%. And definitely, thinking about these counter-cyclical measures that I mentioned during my presentation, thinking about infrastructure investment, that would be a good way of not only closing gaps in terms of infrastructure that we mentioned this before, but also in terms of increasing employment, because construction, of course, has a very important contribution to employment growth in Colombia. So those are my points. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis. The next question is for Rosario, because you mentioned education in your answer as being one of the really important aspects. Whereabouts is Colombia in terms of education and in terms of the technical capacities of its population? And how attractive is it for international investors regarding the capabilities they can find in Colombians?
Well, I mentioned education because it's very linked to productivity. And what we have seen with this crisis is that we really have to improve our teaching for, technicians and mainly in digital areas. But I think that we have a great human capital here in Colombia, and that we are now trying to improve our capabilities. So I think it would be very interesting for some investors to come to the country, and maybe they can even foster some of this education.
Thank you, Rosario. That is really helpful. This question is for Germán, which is around corruption. What would you say are some of the worst kind of aspects of corruption, and which institutions are most captured by corruption?
Well, I don't think it's a matter of pointing out particular institutions. I think it's a widespread challenge and problem for Colombia as a whole, as a nation. You see corruption almost in every field of activity, both public and private. I think what Andrés was mentioning is also worth mentioning. Corruption, people tend to think about only on the public sector, but there's similar kinds of corrupt practices coming from the private sector. So I wouldn't point any particular institution because I think it's something across the board that we need to address in that view. Again, I think all the measures and the ideas that have been commented here during the event are very, very adequate and should be implemented.
Thank you. Thank you, Germán. We've got another question here from Santiago, which asks, what can the OECD and Colombia's membership to the OECD do to help improve the rule of law ranking? Andreas, you haven't answered a question yet. I was wondering if you had anything to say on that.
I think it helps very much because we do have to implement the best practices, and one of the main knowledges or the gaining that we have in the OECD is to sit down with our other counterparts in different countries and analyze legislation, what the regulatory landscape is, and to try to implement or copy, in the good sense of the word, the best practices they have. This has had a huge impact, for instance, in our competition law, consumer protection law, and we do think that having a seat with our counterparts in more developed countries gives us a feedback in order to implement the best regulatory measures. So I think it reflects very good in our own legislative landscape.
Thank you so much for that answer. I think we have time for one more question. Stephen, I'll ask this one from you. What should be measures to help SMEs, small and medium enterprises, in terms of support and budget to get them into international markets, or just to improve generally?
Well, I think what has been happening quite recently is a good start in terms of the work that's been done on one-stop shops to make it easier for them to set up. I think the next challenge really is a scale-up challenge, and I think one of the things that we have seen is that access to capital is good in the big cities and good through the banking system, but for risk capital, it's less available. So if I were looking at that, I would be saying, where are the fintech solutions? Where are the venture capital solutions? There was a very interesting article in the Financial Times about 4 or 6 weeks ago, highlighting entrepreneurship, particularly in Medellin. I think they featured a new fintech startup who was really focusing on giving risk capital to entrepreneurs. I think going back up one stage and saying, actually, how do I promote the development of risk capital is probably a really good way of actually promoting entrepreneurship in the longer run. So you might focus one step back upstream.
Thank you so much, Stephen. That's all we have time for today. We've run over a little bit, and thank you for staying with us. Thank you especially to all of our panelists for their amazing contributions, for their insight. We really value it and appreciate it. I'd also like to acknowledge the hard work and the insight given by a wide range of experts throughout this report. They're all acknowledged in the report, and you can find them there, but we have talked to dozens of people who have contributed to it. And we also want to give a special thanks to the Templeton World Charity Foundation for making this possible. You can find both English and Spanish versions at www.li.com, along with all our other work. And please also email us at economic.openness@li.com. We produce these indexes and reports to help identify policy solutions that will deliver lasting change to countries around the world. So please get in touch if you have any questions or any insight. And we would love to help out in any way we can. We look forward to working with you to deliver greater economic and social well-being in Colombia and around the world, in what will be some very challenging years ahead. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of the day.